being without a home, it's like, well, what am I going to do to survive this day? How can I fix this? Or, being passed around and stuff from family to family, it's like, well, not get too comfortable because, you just got to have to leave again.
We can hear the resignation in that young man's voice as he reflects on his experiences in foster care. I'm John Fuller, and this is Focus on the Family with Focus President and author Jim Daly. And Jim, this is a subject matter that we're passionate about, and you really lead the charge here at Focus in caring about orphans.
Well, I do, John, and 47 times in Scripture, the Lord says, take care of the widow and the orphan. And that's what motivates me. I certainly had those experiences as an orphan. And my mom and dad died by the time I was 12, and that shot me on a trajectory that helped me learn a lot about what happens when you don't have a mom and dad. And, our guest today, I'm excited to talk with our guest today because he is such an advocate for the cast-aside children in our communities. And that's where we want to be. That's how I feel. I believe that's where Focus on the Family is at. It's the Lord's heart. And when we can line up with the Lord's heart, that's a good thing, John. And our goal today is to help you better understand life through the eyes of one of these children and then challenge you to ask God what you can do about it. John, often I talk about that early church and the idea of orthopraxis. That's the doing of the word. And it's important that we have orthodoxy, speaking the truth. But what the world needs to see and what we need to do is the doing of the word. It does something to us to see God in action in that way. And there's no better way than to help the orphan. And Rob Mitchell is our guest, and he's written a book, Castaway Kid. And it really is a story of his journey, John. And it's a compelling story. Rob, it is great to have you here at Focus on the Family.
Thank you, Jim. I am really thrilled to be here.
Rob, we're going to take a lot of twists and turns today, and I want everybody listening to be ready emotionally, because I can feel it coming, and I think the Lord is going to visit this discussion in a powerful way. Let's start with an obvious question. How old were you when your mother dropped you off at the orphanage? Give us a little bit of background. What compelled your mom to do that? And then answer that very difficult question. How did you feel?
I was 3 years old when we were living in Chicago. My father abandoned my mother and I, put a gun to his head, and tried to kill himself. But he failed in his own suicide. And a man with a college degree, a master's degree from prestigious Northwestern University, spent the next 26 years of his life as a walking vegetable in a mental hospital. He could walk, but he could not talk. He could put food in his mouth, but not always chew and swallow because of the bullet damage.
What, just for the background, Rob, what led him to that desperate moment to try to kill himself?
I think a lot of it, in all honesty, was my mother. My mother had enormous emotional and psychological problems that she had masked prior to marriage, but those masks always come down. And he didn't know how to deal with those issues. There were times that she would just disappear without explanation, sometimes 1 or 2 days at a time, and he'd come home from work and find me laying in the crib, apparently there all day, completely soiled. And I don't know if he really knew the Lord. I have no evidence one way or another of a deep personal faith. He turned to alcohol, as many do, to drown his sorrows, and eventually, in his own desperation and darkness, tried to kill himself.
And so your mom was not stable.
No.
And was struggling herself. And you're 3 years old, and she drops you off at the orphanage. What was your first kind of recognition that this is not where I should be?
One of the things I've learned, Jim, that kids at risk, kids like us, kids in crisis, they have a moment in time that they either block out and never remember, or we never forget it. And I won't forget that day. My mother drugged me from Chicago by train. It was January, to a little town called Princeton, Illinois. And I remember her dragging me from the Princeton train station through the snow, and I'm whimpering and I'm afraid because something's wrong. And my mother's yelling at me, "Shut up, Robbie. Shut up." She takes me in this great big strange building and takes me and sits me in front of a strange boy and says, "Play with the blocks." and I reach for a block and he steals it, and I reach for a block and he steals it. And I turn to my mother for help, and she's gone. She didn't say I love you. She didn't say I'm sick. She's just gone.
She never came back at that point.
Not for several years. And this strange woman whose name and face I don't remember said, "Your mother's sick, Robbie. She's taking the train back to Chicago. She'll come get you when she's well." And I truly remember rising up off that floor in 3-year-old clumsiness and screaming. This woman said, "Quit crying or I'll spank you." How does a 3-year-old quit crying when his mother's abandoned him?
Yeah.
And she picked me up and spanked me over and over again until the pain of being spanked was worse than the pain of being abandoned.
I can't imagine that feeling for you at that age. I mean, that desperation. Actually, I can feel some of that. I had similar circumstances, but not exactly. I didn't feel that abandonment quite that same way. I always knew that through my mom's death and then eventually my dad's death, those were things I couldn't control. But here you were trying to process as a little boy why your mommy would give you up. Tell us about the next couple of years. What happened? What was it like living in an orphanage?
The Covenant Children's Home was started in 1921. When I was abandoned there, it was a large institutional, stereotypical dormitory-type structure. And there's a photograph in Castaway Kid. There were 60 kids broken into 4 groups: little boys, little girls, big boys, big girls, plus staff. We would all eat breakfast at 7:30, lunch was noon, cookies and bug juice at 3 o'clock, and supper's 5:30. So it was a very regimented, organized kind of life in a large dormitory-type structure. I think the 2 adjectives that best describe it, one is desperate loneliness. It was a Christian orphanage children's home. And people think, how can you be with 60 kids and staff and be alone? But you can be desperately alone in life. You can be in a marriage and be desperately alone. Kids are egocentric. We think that whatever happens to us in life is our fault. The kids in Beverly Hills who live in mansions think they were born to deserve that. But kids in orphanages, kids in the foster care system, we think we deserve that. And that's not right, but it's how we feel.
Now, you had a family member, I believe, who visited you regularly. Did that give you a sense of stability? Tell us about her and your connection to her.
I was my mother's only child. She was her mother's only child. I call that grandmother Gigi. She was a poor woman who lived in Chicago. She worked at the great Marshall Fields department store downtown Chicago. And it took her months to find out what happened to me because people with mental and emotional illness like my mother play weird power games. And when she finally found me, she would come visit every Saturday. She lived in a 2-room apartment, not a 2-bedroom apartment in North Chicago. And she'd get up, walk 3 city blocks to the Howard Street bus, the bus to the L downtown, couple buses later to the Union Station, and then a 2-hour train ride to Princeton. And Gigi would come every Saturday and visit for a couple hours before she had to take the train back. And it was always bittersweet. I never understood as a little kid why she didn't take me, but she would always say goodbye in tears and say, "Remember, Robbie, keep love in your heart. You will always have mine."
Did you ever, it's a good thing for a child to hear, did you ever have that discussion with Gigi? Gigi, why can't I live with you? Did you ask her that?
And I would say that I had it at 3 levels. First, as a little kid, it was, take me with you. Don't leave me here. What I came to understand later in life, my mother was in and out of psychiatric wards, oftentimes locked down against her will, multiple electroshock therapy, abused drugs and alcohol, died a bag lady in the streets of Chicago. But I came to realize later, not from what Gigi said directly, that she just didn't have the emotional strength to fight her daughter when my mother was out on the streets. because my mother would have hounded her and hounded her. And Gigi felt I was safer in the orphanage than being with her.
You're listening to Focus on the Family. I'm Jim Daly. We're talking with our guest today, Rob Mitchell, his book, Castaway Kid. Rob, I can feel with Gigi, there are people in my life when my mom died and my dad was nowhere to be found. I was 9 years old and desperately thinking, who will take us? Who will take me? And am I worthy enough? All those things that a little child begins to process. And there was a woman in my life, Penny, who was my Gigi in your case, and she couldn't step up. I never had that discussion. It always left me wondering why she didn't do that. She was my mom's best friend.
Mm-hmm.
And what I didn't know at the time is that her husband was actually dying of stomach cancer. So
Mm-hmm.
she had her hands full.
Mm-hmm.
And but it made me feel, in many ways, unwanted,
Mm-hmm.
right on top of everything else that was going on. Did you have that feeling with Gigi? Did you feel like I'm not good enough for her to take me home with her?
I never felt that about Gigi. I did feel that wondering along the way why some of my relatives in Atlanta didn't take me. My father's extended family there was fairly well-to-do. I came to learn later in life they blamed it all on my mother, but I think the more honest answer is I was a social embarrassment. And it was more convenient to leave me in an orphanage than explain me in their social circles.
That tears my heart apart. And there's kids. I mean, Rob, the thing that's so tragic is that there are children today in foster care, today's modern version of the orphanage. You know, we changed that system many years ago and did away with orphanages because of the stigma that's attached to it. And we created the foster care program where some kids land in good places, and we need to make sure that we acknowledge that there are good foster care parents. There are some not so good ones as well. And abuse takes place and all the things that some of us experienced in our foster care time. But Rob, when did you feel as a child, when did you feel different? When did you recognize that I'm not living life like every other kid?
Because I was dropped off at 3, I had a couple years of protection from public schools. But once I started going to public school, that's when I really realized that I was different. And there are bullies everywhere in the world, every culture. Yeah. And bullies want to put you down in order to lift themselves up. And kids like us are easy targets.